All right, everyone, thank you for joining us for today's webinar. It's an HR series webinar and it's mental health in the workplace. And really, we wanted to put this webinar together in the spirit of May, which is, as everyone's aware, Mental Health Month. So, of course, we're talking mental health. It's a little bit different of a webinar format. We're not going to sit and present in a lecture style so much today. It's going to be a little bit more like ESPN First Take with some great panelists. And I'll do quick introduction of the panelists. We have Regina Romeo, Jacques Whitfield, Amanda Gibson, and Tyler Arguello. And as far as setting the stage, I'll do real quick introductions. Regina is the CHRO for CPS HR, and she's our practice leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion. She's a Forbes published author and an avid fan of shoes, which you can see on her over her right shoulder in the video. She also is a host in our podcast, Work Life Unbalanced. Jacques has over 20 years of experience in HR, employment relations, and legal compliance in both public sector and the private sector. And he leverages his deep passion of teaching and learning to empower and arm public sector organizations with tools to achieve organizational performance. Fun fact about Jacques is he also works as a professional model in TV and internet commercials, sometimes in France, but sometimes in the US. So if he looks familiar, you might be watching internet ads in French. Amanda Gibson is a licensed clinical social worker, consultant, and speaker with 15 years experience. She treats adults and families in the areas of child welfare, domestic violence, trauma, chronic health, and mental health and wellness. And on the side, she leverages her creativity and her creative outlet during COVID as a personal stylist. And she has tons of style options around her to, I guess, express her creativity there. Tyler is an associate professor at the graduate program director in the Division of Social Work at California State University, Sacramento. He researches intergenerational stress within queer populations and maintains a small private practice in Sacramento. Tyler, a fun fact, is also the founder of #RunCovidRun, where he documents his COVID workouts through photography and social media. So check out that #RunCovidRun. This session is being recorded. We'll post a link, as I mentioned before, on the webinar page of our website as soon as it's available. And if you have any questions, you can ask them in the Q&A and chat, and we'll try to get to them as much as possible. We have some prearranged questions that we're going to go through. And in order to ensure a high quality recording, all attendees are in listen only mode and are encouraged to mute your mic. So now with that, let's get started. I'll turn it over to you first, Regina, with the big question of how did we get here? Like, what happened that we're now in the place that we are? And I'm going to unmute all of our panelists here.
I think for our generation, first of all, I want to say those are my emotional support shoes. And I think that for our generation, this is going to be, where were you when Kennedy was shot? It's like, where were you when COVID hit? Because I remember doing this webinar last year when we were talking mental health in the workplace. And it was, hey, okay, everybody shelter at home, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Am I the only one that remembers that? And now here we are a year later, still kind of battling with a lot of the things that have come out of the pandemic. So I think because this event is unlike some of the other events where we experience a tornado or a wildfire or an earthquake, where there's like a set event and we have a playbook for it, it's just gone on and been so chaotic and stressful for people, in addition to some of the unintended consequences in terms of your childcare being unavailable, worrying about your parents, not being able to see your parents. What are you going to do with your kids when you're homeschooling? What if you only have one computer? And all of the other things that we've had to deal with. And then with remote work, like we say, you don't work from home, you live at work. So just all of the changes have been such a roller coaster for people. And now with the advent of returning to the workplace, there's just a lot of stress, and anxiety that people are dealing with on top of what they may have already been dealing with in their personal lives. And I think
Can
I'm
unmute you here. Yes, sorry.
okay.
So Tyler and Amanda, you kind of have a different perspective, obviously, than Regina and Jacques might from a consulting standpoint, in that you're dealing with either, students going through this as a first time in their life and dealing with these sort of emotions, or clients as they're seeing you and your practices kind of handle this. You know, as far as, how we're here and what we can do to help ourselves mentally cope with even just the status of where we are. What do you tell people? What should I do as I'm freaking out in my world of, do I wear a mask? Do I not wear a mask? Is the shot safe? Is it not safe? Like, how do I deal with all of this stuff? Go for it.
Amanda, do you want to go first?
You go ahead. I'll piggyback off of you.
Yeah, I think, so again, specifically sort of centering mental health, right? And managing our own mental health, or really, I mean, it's not only about managing our mental health, but also being aware of mental health as a thing that everyone's contending with. One thing I would say, working in the realm of HR, while I haven't done that, as you think about how best to serve your employees or other stakeholders, I can speak from experience of my own private practice, from supervising students at agencies throughout our region. One thing that's a reality this year is the show rate is through the roof, almost 100%, if we're looking at private clinics, public clinics, hospitals. So there is absolutely a real sort of strain on the system, which in some ways is a helpful thing, right? Because people are showing up, but it is a difficult thing because people are showing up, right? And so people having access and people getting the treatment they need is always important, and just becomes so much more important. I think there's a sort of like a kind of easy stereotype going around that, like, oh, everyone's just flooding into mental health clinics, private practice, because they're sort of complaining about COVID. I can say, just from my corner of the world, and the people I work with, and hearing these stories of why people are showing up, I don't see people showing up explicitly because, oh, COVID, this trauma of COVID with a capital C is affecting my life in these obvious ways. Instead, people are seeking out mental health treatment, from my experience, um, because COVID only exposed, like we know in so many other parts of our life, it has exposed what's been under the table, right? Or it's only exposed what we have been sort of sometimes kidding ourselves about, living in denial about. And so that could be, maybe COVID's exposing that we have overdrank, overused drugs, over the top, whatever. Or COVID has exposed traumas that we maybe thought we were okay with, but because we've been pushed to the brink physically, mentally, socially, economically, now it becomes unmanageable, right? And so people are coming into therapy, oftentimes what I'm seeing, um, or looking for some sort of mental health service, because life has just become unmanageable, or parallel, it's time to finally address these things. So I guess I'll leave it at that. I don't know if Amanda, you want to sort of speak more to.
Yes, I would agree. Very, very similar things I'm seeing in my virtual office as well. And also, too, people are taking time to take stock and inventory in their lives. Like, what gives me meaning and purpose? So I'm having a lot of conversations with people. I've had clients make big changes in their life, like moving, changing jobs, a lot of relationship status changes as well. Because to your point, Tyler, anything that was pre-existing, like if there was maybe some unhealthy relationship behaviors going on, now people are stuck at home, and it just sort of exploded. And there are very serious consequences, all the way up to increased domestic violence that we're seeing in relationships, that we need to be very aware of, as we're having these conversations. Because I think when we've been working remotely, to some extent, there is a level of exposure, like you can see in each other's homes, but you may not be able to see really behind the scenes of, am I also caregiving for an older adult? Is there grief and loss going on in my life? And then just managing boundaries and relationships too, risk tolerance to COVID exposure. That's been a common topic throughout the pandemic from the different health directives we've gotten, that maybe one person in a relationship has a higher risk tolerance than another, and they feel comfortable going outside without a mask, but their partner doesn't, and then they're fighting about that. And then maybe one half of the family is getting together and the other half isn't. I mean, the really big stressors around those conversations. And now there was this easing into mask mandates. Now we're coming out of it, and people are still having levels of risk tolerance going on. I think it's really important that we don't shame people and we don't judge people, and that we really have open dialogue in preparation for any kind of social interaction to make sure that we are making the person that maybe has the least amount of risk tolerance the most comfortable. But those have been very common themes in my office all year long.
Do you guys think that, as my German Shepherd enters the room, do you guys think that, this sort of unmasking of mental health issues through COVID, where we're sort of bringing other things to light, in the end is going to be helpful for people as a whole because they're dealing with underlying issues? Or do you think that we're surfacing more things that are going to be harmful?
I don't think, and Jacques, you could speak to this as well. I don't think that unmasking those things is ever harmful if you're also taking the time to address them with whatever professional assistance you might need. Because I think historically, Jacques and I being in the HR space, you see people who are workaholics who want to work until all hours of the night because they want to avoid their domestic situation, or they're using work as a to help them not have to deal with something else. So it's like, as a supervisor or manager, you're like, wow, Jason is killing it this week. He's here for 50 or 60 hours. And to me, that's always been a cry for help. Like, I don't think that it's healthy to work yourself into that much of an overworks kind of a
I
situation.
got a lot done. Okay, I got a lot done.
But I think during the pandemic, what I've seen is with remote work, I would be getting emails from people 1 and 2 in the morning, 24/7, around the clock, where it's like, okay, you're kind of saturating yourself with work. So to me, trying to be mindful of what that person is experiencing, I will at first say, you could quit at 5 o'clock. It's okay, to separate yourself, because it's difficult to when those boundaries get blurred. But to also understand that maybe that person is trying to tell me something and they may not have the words for it. So when dealing with some of these stressors and their anxieties, that's their, go-to. So Jacques, I'm sure you've probably seen the same things with some of the stuff you do in the HR space.
Absolutely. And I'm even thinking, I'm reflecting on a lot of things, Regina. So first of all, I'm looking at it a perspective, and Jason, I appreciate the way you asked the question, but I think it's impossible for us to unring the bell now, because for those of us in the HR space, we are having these conversations, and I can't foresee a situation in which we're no longer going to have these conversations, because it's entered our lexicon, it's entered our common knowledge. And now, and those of us in California, where we're dealing with FEHA and ADA and reasonable accommodations, and that whole interactive process mechanisms that the employer knew or should have known, well, now the employer knows way more than we want to know. Right? So then you begin that methodology, but you also begin the fact that we as HR professionals are also experiencing the same level of trauma. I think, Regina, the event to me that more closely parallels where I've seen this before is during 9/11. I was a senior leader in K-12 education during 9/11. And even though we were on the West Coast, the protocols changed, and we had to do a lot of emergency protocols in terms of managing people, managing students. But I'm sure that would be completely different if we were in the city of New York, as opposed to being here in California. And this is a situation that now I find myself, I am a caregiver. I'm a caregiver for an older parent. And in one more hour, I have a DEI presentation that I've got to do, and I'm managing my mom at the same time. So I'm experiencing it. Our team members, our employees are experiencing this level of mental stress. And so now I think, Jason, to your question, I don't think it is a bad thing. I think we can't unring the bell. And now it becomes part of our new standard operating procedure, where now we get to explore those places that heretofore we have not explored, only in the situation of a reasonable accommodation, or where it was episodic. I think now it's a lot more routine. And that's certainly what we're experiencing in the client space, because everybody is now disclosing these issues. And we're dealing with where it would be a garden variety performance management issue. Now all of a sudden it's woven into these mental health
underlying issues. Yeah.
Exactly. So makes our life very exciting, never a dull moment, and never the same day twice. And that in itself leads to some mental health, issues.
So Tyler, you mentioned kind of in our pre-call about just how your students at Sac State were feeling, and like so happy to be done with this year. And you mentioned how sort of proud you were of their hard work and dedication during this year, but also at the same time saying from a faculty standpoint, like, we're done, like we need to go. And so, I mean, everybody's dealing with these mental health issues, whether it's employee, student, faculty, professional, doctor, right? And how do we destigmatize that and bring in how do people ask for help? How do they get help in a way that's not I guess doesn't make them feel worse from a mental health perspective, and doesn't make them feel like a victim or anything like that? Both Allison and Tyler, I'd like to get your feedback on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can take it. I don't know if you want to speak. Okay.
Go ahead.
So, well, I mean, I think that a couple things to unpack there, sort of destigmatizing, and then in some ways to maybe reframe what you said, sort of like normalizing, right? I think one kind of piggybacking off of that idea of like what Amanda was speaking to, like the typical things people are coming to services for. I think one of the big areas to destigmatize is, sure, there's a whole host, right? There's a whole book of diagnoses, right? And so we can talk about like depression with a capital D, but also each kind of condition also has like depression with a lowercase d, right? We can have situations that elicit difficult sort of mental health challenges, but they do not mean that you necessarily are having depression with a huge capital D, which then the prognosis is like, we need to avoid reoccurrences and we need to medicate. And right, we all have to walk down this, intense sort of tragic pathway, portending that something fatal is going to happen in your life because you're having a situational issue. So I think people understanding that, you can have challenging times and have depression and have some anxiety, and it doesn't mean that it's going to be lifelong. It can be getting through the situation. And so sort of taking that layer off, that mental health does not mean severe and persistent mental illnesses for everyone. And also to that point of like, as folks are saying here, like the trauma of this past year or the trauma of other events, I oftentimes talk with clients, with students, with colleagues about the fact that when we talk about trauma, and it is a bit of a kind of buzzword now, getting kind of play across everyday pedestrian spaces as well as clinical spaces. There is also trauma with a capital T and trauma with a lowercase t. And if we're talking about major traumas that we would think would result in PTSD, and I think a lot of the framing of COVID has been like, everyone must be having PTSD. Well, the reality is, from our sort of population level data, we know that it is one of the most common things across the adult life course that people will experience, upwards of 80% of the population will experience in their lifetime a traumatic event that could lead to PTSD. The reality of who actually gets PTSD is we're talking of that 80%-ish, only about 10 to 12% actually develop clinically indicated, diagnosed PTSD. So then the question becomes like, what's actually the upshot of that? The mass majority of the population does not develop PTSD, right? And so when we think about this past year, you know, the data has yet to come in about who has been diagnosed with PTSD because of COVID. So that is an issue, sure, of import. But how are people getting through this year? And how are people, to some of the larger points, how are people recreating their world right now? How are people able to come into therapy, for example, and they may think that they have major depression? Well, they may not be diagnosed with major depression after an assessment, but they have things that they need to talk about. They have things that they need to rework through. They have things that they need to recreate in their lives, right? As Amanda said, like ending relationships, starting new relationships, drawing boundaries, right? Those things are quite common in everyone's life, whether or not they're in talk therapy. And that's what, you know, this past year has offered, you know, abjectly and implicitly. How are we going to redo the way we function in our social world, in our interior private world, in our relationships? And that in and of itself is a mental health promoting endeavor that everyone has been engaging in different ways, in small and large ways.
Regina, gonna hit you with one that we didn't talk about before, but with the these sort of mental health issues as an HR professional, if people have questions or are looking for resources, what types of resources are typically available in different organizations that someone could leverage within their benefits, and especially public sector and all that?
Well, one of the things I wanted to say about what Tyler was saying is that, you know, we are experiencing this collective trauma. You know, everybody's going through, it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, what your background is. And much like 9/11, we didn't know what to expect next. You know, is there going to be another attack? So that level of angst is definitely there. And I think being, I think so for employee assistance programs, for example, EAP, that's one of the resources that most of our employers will offer. But historically, EAP has been one of the least utilized benefits, even before the pandemic, like ever, because I think there's still that hesitation where people don't want to be labeled. They don't want to say, well, I need to go to HR so I can get a referral to EAP because that's going to raise questions about me. Now I'm going to be that guy, and there's going to be some, you know, stigma attached to it, some feelings associated with it, even if you're going to EAP to deal with, you know, a loss, even if you're going there to deal with grief. But because there's so many things that fall under that umbrella for counseling, for substance abuse, for domestic violence, or whatever, exposing yourself that way has been a no thank you for a lot of people. So what I've seen over the last year is an uptick in the usage of EAP. And what we have done for our employees is just put the link out there. So you don't have to come to me or anybody on my staff in order to take advantage of the resource that's there. So I don't even know. We get a utilization report at the end of the year that is completely sanitized. There's no name associated with it. It's just X amount of employees, you know, used this benefit. And I think by taking some of that oversight, you know, and making it completely anonymous and confidential so that people, but like, you know, keep continually reminding people that it's there for their use, but there's nobody here that's going to know anything about it, brings kind of a level of comfort to people. And I know that, you know, when we were talking before, Amanda said that she had been working with some employers who were offering additional benefits above and beyond, so she could probably also offer some insight into the program she did.
Yes, I want to encourage people to be creative about how you're bringing mental health into the workplace. Maybe considering talking to a local counseling agency, which is what happened here in Sacramento. I'm doing some webinars for agencies, and then going over all of their benefits, but also offering a locally based option. And so we're doing 2-session mental wellness checkups at the Counseling Co-Lab in Sacramento. All of it's being done on telehealth too, which I think is a huge plus for accessibility. And even with my clients, when we're making their appointments, they're just blocking on their schedule. They're unavailable for a meeting. And sometimes they are going from one Zoom meeting to telehealth therapy to another Zoom meeting. And we have to talk about, you know, having some little moments and breaks and ways to take care of yourself. But it is much more accessible than I have before going in person. I have to request time off. It's a 2-hour process. So I don't think I think the stigma is getting better. And if we can really show all the different ways you can access mental health right now, I think it helps a little bit, because sometimes if someone calls their health plan and they're trying to get on a therapist panel, it can be a little bit difficult, but there are a lot of us offering this online, and there's other tools too that have come up that people are probably seeing getting pushed on their social media for different online therapy platforms that are more text-based. But it's been really great to be connecting with small business owners in the local area to say, yeah, you maybe don't need you're not having a full depressive episode, but let's talk about how are you really doing? Because one thing that has been definitely showing up is this idea of languishing, which is really the absence of mental wellness and kind of just being blah and meh and not that great, but not that bad. The research shows that languishing actually can have some negative health benefit outcomes. So I think it's important that if someone is kind of not doing that great, that they know that that's an okay time to get help. You don't have to wait until you're feeling suicidal to call a therapist.
And I think that's especially important in the remote workspace because it's very easy to fade into the background, So when people are already feeling isolated and they're not sure, it's like, am I okay? Should I be reaching out? But they don't have either the language for it or they don't know how to make that happen because a lot of times, like Amanda was saying, just getting the healthcare, going through and getting a referral and all this other stuff is more laborious than the energy that that person might have to devote to that. So they just figure, I'm not going to do it at all. So really being verbal and vocal is, I feel, what my responsibility is as an HR person, to make sure that everybody knows what we offer and how to go about doing that, and any type of support that I can offer to an individual or to a family or to a group to say, here's what you might want to consider, like Amanda was saying, text-based options, telehealth options, or any of the other options. Those resources are definitely available.
And Richard, don't you think the opportunity is for our colleagues in our profession is to really more learning and education about what is available? Because so oftentimes, I mean, and you and I have both in our previous positions, current positions, where this wasn't top of mind, and it's like, oh yeah, let me look in that file and find out where this information is about the EAP. Now this is top of mind. And so even at the analyst, the HR technician, HR analyst level, there should be far more learning and education to know all of the tools, all of the resources available, so that, and then making those resources available, as you said, Regina, in a very non-threatening, in a way that exactly, total ease of use. But again, and this goes back to an earlier question that you raised, Jason, we can't unring the bell. And so this has now become a fabric of the new normal, from my perspective.
And from that new normal, you mentioned, in the other room, you're taking care of a loved one and you're dealing with work and you're going out and doing DI consulting and all these different things. And so turning the page to struggling with those boundaries between that work-life balance, which may be a shameless plug for our podcast, Work-Life Balance, available on iTunes and Spotify and wherever you get your podcast. But so to deal with that work-life balanced perspective, like what do you personally do, Jacques? And then and Regina, and then to go to the larger, like what should we do, Tyler and Amanda, from your expert opinion. So we'll see if what y'all do is what they say you should.
So I'm going to imagine you mean our healthy habits for COVID. Yeah. Go ahead, John. Go ahead.
So what I personally do is I have become far more mindful of my mental and emotional well-being. I practice mindfulness. I practice meditation. I have been a coach and a faculty member of a transformation program. I am also a student in that program. And so again, for me, it's about practicing what I preach. And, for all of our Brene Brown fans out there, we cannot operate with courageous leadership without being vulnerable. So one of my big stretch growth moments is for me to approach my my senior leader, my CHRO, and say, I think I'm going to have to tap out. I can't. And that is, it's a scary space. It's a new space because, again, being in the position that I've been in over the 25 years I've been working, I never wanted to place myself in that situation. I'm grateful for this experience because it's taught me that everyone gets to go through this, and we all get to operate in vulnerability if we want to be connected. And so I'm really pleased at the feedback that I've gotten from my CHRO. Thank you, Regina. But again, it makes us stronger because, again, I was one of those people, Jason, during the height of the pandemic. I was reading 5 books a month. And before I talked to my therapist, I'm like, look how incredibly productive I'm being, pat myself on the back. And my therapist said, this is a cry for help. Jacques, you were reading 1 book a month and that was great, but 5 books a month, dude, you need to have a timeout, and just really recognizing, and it was raising a point that Regina had raised earlier, when you're seeing activity, whether it's a seemingly hyper-productive activity, that may also be an indication of feedback that there gets to be some intervention there. And so that was the case for me. And so now I'm down to 2 books a month. I'm happy to say, and just taking more time.
Right.
Regina, what else would you add to that?
I would say that there's definitely, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this what I call pandemic performance pressure, because the messaging was, oh my gosh, now that you have more time, you could do, you can learn to play a new instrument, learn another language, work on your summer body. And I'm just like, okay, but I haven't played my clarinet since 7th grade. I did start taking Spanish, but I was going to do that anyway. But this summer is going to get the body that I give it. So my coping strategies have been to try to maintain some sense of normalcy and scheduling that I had even before the pandemic. So basically not feeding into that hyperactivity, because that's very easy for me to fall into, where it's like, oh, well, people need this and I got to do this and I got to, be all over the place, to the point where I'm burning myself out because I'm dealing with the same pandemic that everybody else is dealing with. But how we maintain some level of normalcy, setting yourself up on a schedule, making sure that you shower every day, making sure that I, put my face on every day and everything, because it was very easy to show up for a Zoom meeting in your pajamas, keep your camera off. I will admit that I maybe took a couple of meetings in a horizontal position, where it's just like, I'm not even gonna put the effort in today. But there were so many things that were so overwhelming. You have to allow yourself to experience that and then think, okay, like Tyler was saying, this is not going to be a lifelong thing, but let me feel my feelings, and then let me kind of revisit how I can regroup and then come back that much stronger. So I actually built that shoe rack from raw materials. I done a DIY in probably every room of my home, but I've always been a crafter. I've never been like a person who, I like to use my hands. And so that becomes very meditative for me. And so even though I'm not quote unquote meditating, getting into a craft, sketching something out, watching it come to life is definitely what I do. So for the second half, let's say, of the pandemic, that's what I've been doing around my house. And as we open up and we are able to gather again and be social again, then, I'll be able to layer those things back into. But you really, and again, speaking for myself and for some of the folks that have touched bases with me, we've all gone to some dark places that we probably did not anticipate over the last year. So there's been a full circle of emotions and experience for all of us, and even those of us that are, like Jacques, where it's like work, I'm going to do this, I'm hitting it so hard, I'm doing, blah, 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 or whatever. And that's your norm where you're getting stuff done. The languishing is real. The feeling like the rug's been pulled out from under you, but having that be okay, not to be okay, within the situation, because this is like nothing any of us have ever seen before.
Hey, Regina, can I ask a question before we have our mental health expert?
Sure.
Upon. So you raise a really interesting point right there. So how do we as HR folks how do we navigate the languishing, which is real,
Mhm.
from true performance management issues? What would be your suggestion or your method of approach when we've got something that appears to be manifesting as performance issues, but
Uh-huh.
maybe
There's
on further
yeah.
examination, exactly.
Communication. Communication is a big thing, because I might find, okay, this person is normally, good at meeting their deadlines. And like I said, maybe they're fading into the back, they're canceling meetings, they're not showing up or whatever. So my first engagement is just going to say, are you okay? I think a lot of times when we talk about performance, we immediately want to jump to from, okay, just managing that person's performance to discipline. Like, oh, well, now we have a problem. It's like, yeah, well, you might have a problem, but let's back up a little bit. Let's have a conversation about what's going on in that person's life. And that's going to be the opportunity for them to disclose to you, I'm struggling. My husband got laid off. My kids are here 24/7. There's an expectation that I'm going to not just be your employee, but now I have to be a full-time school teacher. I have to figure out how to entertain these kids, that are stuck in the house with me. And so people are dealing with a lot of things that were completely unanticipated. So your first course of action as a person, as an HR professional, or just a supervisor or manager, just a friend, just a peer, is to just say, are you okay? And what's going on, without coming in with some preconceived notions about, oh, well, now we're going to have to do this and we're going to have to do that. But to understand what we're dealing with, not just with work, but on a global level right now. This is not, so when you and I have had conversations, for example, my first thing is take the day. The thing is, nobody wants to do your work anyway. So your work is going to be here when you get back. So there's not a problem with me telling you, take care of yourself first, because I can't do anything once you burn yourself out. So I want to head that off as much as possible. And, over the course of time, even like I said, before the pandemic, I would have employees who stress themselves into heart attacks and heart disease and strokes and all other kinds of problematic, health issues that could have been avoided if we took the time to talk and really provide some care, and just to be a resource for each other.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. And I don't
So
know if
from
Amanda or
the
Dr. Child would like to
experts,
say something. Yes.
did the answers or the perspectives they take for their own lives make sense, or should they take 2 aspirin and call you in the morning? Like what what is the right way, and is there a right way to deal with all this stuff?
There's really not. I mean, that's what really working with a mental health professional can really help you look at what are your coping skills, and how is your nervous system, how is your body responding to the stress that you're under. They did mention a lot of things that have been shown in the science to work, like mindfulness and deep breathing, exercise. Also talking with people about in therapy, your sleep hygiene, not just how are you sleeping, but there's a lot of science and techniques and things that you can try to get good quality sleep and get enough sleep, because sleep disruptions have been something people have reported more during the pandemic. There's also a lot of really great apps that can help you if you're new to meditation or need support with sleep, like the Calm app, My Life, and Headspace. Those are all really great things to try. And then basic things like nutrition and exercise are always things to return to. And then social support and being playful and joyful in what you're doing, like with your hobbies that might be kind of more therapeutic hobbies. And with this culture we have in our society of overproduction and people posting on Instagram all these like house projects they were doing when the beginning of the pandemic, when we talk about recreation and play, we're talking about doing things that get you out of your mind and keep you in a flow state where you're really when we're playing, we're able to be in our nervous system in a way where we're connecting and calm at the same time. And those are things that are going to really down regulate your stress response and give you the ability to write out, the next things that you have to do on your to-do list. So being playful and joyful is also a huge part of mental wellness.
Yeah, and I would piggyback on that and add a couple things. One, in terms of sort of like interventions that you could be doing, um, beyond sort of the things kind of in your own home or community. When we think about working with mental health practitioners, one of the things that has additional stigma is, the big bad psychiatrist, right? People think, oh my God, if I have to go see a psychiatrist, then I'm really bad. And one of the biggest things that I work with folks to destigmatize is that issue of, medications that can work to promote mental well-being briefly, right? Or on the long term. And so uh, some of the work that talk therapists will do is helping folks figure out like when is something, again, sort of situational or can be managed through these a variety of behavioral interventions as has just been listed. And when might it be helpful to have a conversation with, honestly, either your general practitioner or a specialist, a psychiatrist, right? And actually, the mass majority of psychiatric medications are prescribed by general practitioners, right? Things like antidepressants or a variety of anti-anxiety medications. So there is a lot of stigma around medications, and I've been working with folks even prior to the pandemic to, really think about psychiatric medications. Some of them work very quickly within a couple seconds to minutes and are meant to be metabolized very quickly within an hour or 2 hours. There's other medications that we take situationally for 3, 6, 9, 12 months. There are some conditions that require lifelong medication, but that is very not the typical situation, right? It is not typical that people are having, experiencing schizophrenia. That is a very real disorder, but that is not common, right? And that would indicate lifelong medication. So if we step way back from the edge, something like an antidepressant can be helpful to ride out the next number of months. I think on top of that too, I guess I'll go back to behavioral interventions. I think a couple things that folks have said, I just want to kind of amplify or give a little bit more oxygen to. A common theme that I heard, and I would just really underscore is whether we're talking about getting through COVID or beyond COVID, it is always helpful in my experience, personally and professionally, to draw boundaries, right? Therapists are known to be anal retentive people with a lot of boundaries, and people say like, why do you have such boundaries? Why won't you talk about yourself or whatever? That's because boundaries are super important and are often experienced as a big no, right? If we draw a boundary, we are saying no to whatever, our children, our employer, our friends, what have you. It can feel that way, but boundaries are much more about, not to sound too cheesy, boundaries are much more about saying yes to yourself, right? That you are understanding what is your threshold, what can you tolerate in that moment. Like Jacques was saying, like, like I need to tap out, right? Drawing a boundary is actually a sign of, I would argue, mental well-being, that you are able to be present enough with yourself in your situation to understand for right now, today, or in this period of time, these are the boundaries that I'm going to operate in that are going to allow me to kind of be the best that I can be, right? And I would also underscore um, uh, some of what Amanda was saying too, like basic needs. Whenever we are in a crisis, and when I work with folks at crisis, I always say, step way back, stop what you're doing, and focus on your basic needs. And that sounds very simple, but what are we all talking about right now? Everyone is so interested to jump to action, right? I need to go do the whatever, the extra project. I need to go read that extra book. I need to go do that extra thing for my children. And we sort of jump over how's our sleep? How's our eating? What are we feeling, right? How's our hygiene? What's the quality of our most trusted relationships, right? How are we behaving with other people? How are we overreacting or reacting? What's our reactivity? And really think about focusing on those basic needs. And I often sort of try to get folks to just sort of tilt your perspective slightly about your basic needs. Like if we were focusing on sleep, under the context of trying to promote our well-being, this is where focusing on sleep is an intervention in our control that is more than sleep. This is when sleep becomes more than sleep. This is when eating something healthy becomes more than eating something healthy. Those can become interventions immediately available, low cost, that we can all do, that the end game isn't, oh, I just feel better because I slept longer. It is knowing I'm doing this because it's going to kind of put in my stockpile a lot of prevention and a lot of sustenance to promote mental well-being.
Amanda, Tyler, Regina, Jacques, we got a question that came in. Anybody have a book recommendation for a non-clinical person to use as self-help for boundaries?
For boundaries.
For boundaries.
I'm curious, Amanda, are there typical books that you recommend? Because I have a couple that I typically recommend.
Yeah, a new one just came out by Terry Cole. I think it's called Boundary Babe or Boundary Badass or something like that. Sorry, that's in the title of the book.
It's a family show. You're fine.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, good.
Just put it in the text communication, so maybe I'm the one that gets in trouble.
Harriet Lerner's, all of Harriet Lerner's books have a lot of great things around boundaries. Glennon Doyle, who is not a therapist, but she talks a lot about boundaries. My sister just sent me a podcast of her and her sister talking about their boundaries in their family. And that's called the Untamed Podcast. And then anything with Brene Brown's work is going to have a lot of talk about boundaries. And one of the things that was most helpful for me and in her work, she has a short YouTube video about boundaries where she talks about you actually can be more empathetic as a person when you have your own boundaries in place. So there's a lot of good stuff out there. Very important topic.
Yeah, and I would add to that list, believe it or not, it's an oldie but a goodie. And it may sound weird that I'm recommending this. I'm not trying to promote 12-step programs, but Codependency No More is just classic.
Yep,
right?
I agree.
And really when we think about codependency, it really, I mean, we could have a whole number of sessions about this, but that's a sort of a type of relationship style where there is a lack of boundaries, right? So you don't have to subscribe to 12-step programs to buy into it or get into the book, but I would recommend that. A book that I recommend too, kind of in this conversation about boundaries and being more present simultaneously. I'm a big fan for The Happiness Trap. And there's actually a visual version of the book. There's web resources. So that's just an easily accessible self-help book that you can kind of take at multiple levels. And I would suggest too one publishing house. I'm not paid by them in any sort of way, but they have a lot of it's called New Harbinger Press. It's located out of Oakland, and they publish a variety of sort of pedestrian type books and workbooks, professional type books and workbooks that are all coming out of very rigorously tested clinical interventions, right? So these would be therapeutic interventions. So this is, talk therapy type stuff, not the psychiatry stuff, but just rigorously tested through randomized clinical trials of behavioral health interventions. So I would just encourage that in particular.
And I thank you very much, Hugo, for looking up the Terry Cole book. I looked up while Tyler and Amanda were talking and pasted a bunch of links to those different books in the chat. So if you want to refer to any of those, go get them. I want to shift.
I have a couple more.
Oh boy,
quick.
Here we go. We got a good list.
Just quick two more. One that I read that was really good. It's called The Age of Overwhelm. And it's basically about our need to be a rapid response to everything. I got to respond to this email. I got to respond to this text message. I got to get this done by close of business or sundown. And the need to have a better strategy, for the long haul. And that came out pre-pandemic. But the strategies remain the same in terms of how to navigate some of that. And then I do a lot of research and reading around compassion fatigue. And one of the other books that I have, it's a kind of a heavy read, so you're going to want to read it in bits and pieces. It's called The The Body Keeps the Score, where it talks about cumulative trauma. And this is a way older book, but really about how you physiologically respond to things, and how if you were already experiencing whatever it was you were experiencing pre-pandemic, the pandemic has exacerbated, what has happened, or what was happening to you prior. It talks about how your body responds to trauma and some of the ways to cope with that. So those were just my two quick recommendations.
And I have one quick one. Her name is Sonia Renee Taylor, and the name of the book is Your Body Is Not an Apology.
Yes.
It's about radical self-love. Sonia Renee Taylor is a colleague of Brene Brown and Glennon Doyle. The book is fabulous, and I've read it like 3 times during the pandemic. So I highly recommend that one.
Awesome. Okay, we got like 8 minutes left. I got one more kind of topic to go around the horn for all you. And during the pandemic, we've had sort of these shifts very quickly, right? From complete lockdown to partial lockdown to not lockdown to just all these different shifts, what we can do at work, what we can do outside, what we can do at a restaurant, like how we live our life. And for some people, shifts are easy. You have like a short-term memory. Like I always try to convince myself that this is the new normal, just get over it, and it takes me about an hour and I'm fine. But that's not normal probably, and a lot of it, there's like a transitional period. It's sort of shining the light on that dramatic shift and change. How do we handle that specifically moving forward as we're going into another shift, right? Where the new normal of masks will maybe become the old normal
The old
of
normal.
life, or maybe not, right? Depending on what the data does. So how do we handle those shifts? Is there any other coping mechanisms than other things that we talked about already? And how should we approach just general news that comes out that's going to change our lives in like 40 seconds, right? Of a CDC announcement.
Right. I would say I felt like I've been waiting for this my whole life. I don't like being that close to people. Maybe too many years riding public transportation in Los Angeles has made me embrace this social distancing and the mask wearing. So for me, I think I'm just trying to go with the flow, because I think what has helped me manage my own personal stress level is the Lord's Prayer, what you do have control over and what you don't have control over, and the wisdom to know the difference. I'm not going to go out and get into a fist fight with somebody at a grocery store or a restaurant because of what they are or aren't doing. That's not my jam. What I'm going to do is to make sure that I'm doing what I need to do, because I'm still a little feeling some type of way about how it was so newsworthy that you need to wash your hands, because I'm like, what were you guys doing all these years before? And that's why I'm like, I'll just keep a distance even after, no matter what the CDC says. But I've always been about making sure that I'm okay, my mom is okay, my family's okay, and because that's all I have control over. What goes on a global perspective, I want to make sure that I'm not causing any harm or violating any rules. And really, that's the only thing that I've been able to do this last year, because there has been these rapid fire changes where we're doing this today, Thursday afternoon, it's a different story. This is going to be in place until a certain day. Now it's extended, and it can be very chaotic on your brain. So I'm just trying to keep my hands clean and moisturized, keep my distance from people, and just let everything that's outside of my control go a little bit, and just focus on the things that I can control.
I totally agree. For me, they say the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. And one of the things that this has demonstrated to me, that there is no certainty, and that the one certain or constant thing we have is change. And so my shift that I'm working with my team is really getting me grounded in, hey, it's all about change. That change is the one constant thing. And for me to recognize that things are going to change, and they're going to change again. And if we don't change or evolve, the opposite of that is not being here. So I would much rather be here and experience the evolutionary change as opposed to not being in the space. And then really just giving myself grace, giving a lot of other people grace. I'm Team Regina, that I'm not going to go in a public space and, argue with people. It's about live and let live, but then just giving grace to everyone, because I realize that we are all figuring it out, that with all due respect to our state, local, and federal experts, that they're even figuring it out. And so I'm giving them a relative degree of grace as well, and just know that we're doing the best we can. I think that that's what's getting me through right now.
Yeah. I don't know if there's stuff you want to add, Amanda?
Well, I think with just understanding the way our brains and bodies work, human beings do not like uncertainty. We are wired to seek safety and determine what's dangerous or not dangerous. So for some people, the changing information and adjusting to that really does create a fight, flight, or freeze response, and can be quite distressing. And it could even change from the environment that you're going in, because you may think there's a rule, and you're trying to find certainty by maybe looking up what a certain place you're going, what their rules are, so you can have some peace of mind, and then you get there and it's different. It's really important to know that you have a choice, and that you can keep yourself safe by using these practices, and you can always leave a situation, and that you feel empowered to make those choices, because that's going to help regulate that fear response that might be coming, that's creating the distress in your body.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that is, as I think the last 4 years we've all been so attuned to being super anxious when any news is coming out, and that has only intensified with COVID, despite the changeover in the administration. And so as we are taking in these messages, and as they may change every day, or the newscasters may portray it in such a dramatic fashion, one thing, and this is free therapy for everyone here. One of the things that I often ask clients when I'm working with them is, where's the fire? Right? So as to Amanda's point, our body is naturally going into this space of, it thinks the house is on fire, but what's crazy making is we don't see the house is on fire, right? And so if we are, this presumes, if we are attuned to how we might be getting anxious, how we might be getting fearful, right? Having this large response, stopping for a second to ask, where is the fire, right? What do I actually need to respond to in this moment, right? Or in the next hour, or in the next day, right?
Mm-hmm. And allowing yourself that timeline, because I always say, I get a lot of anxious people that want to, come to me and talk to me, and even pre-pandemic. And I tell, okay, I hear you, but it's HR, not ER. So no, we can walk ourselves through whatever this process is. And again, God grants you, or, God, Buddha, Allah, Oprah, whatever you believe in, is going to grant you the serenity to understand, this is within my control, this is not within my control. And giving yourself that moment to pause and say, okay, if we could just take a breath with this, and, kind of let our emotions kind of come back down, because it's very easy to run on adrenaline. I'm sure there's folks that are out there that have been running on adrenaline since March 2020, through this whole thing. So hopefully,
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
you know what I mean? So it's just like, hopefully, today will be the day where you allow yourself to, dial that down a little bit. You're fine. We're all trying to just get through the day at this point, so it's just ease into your day, take care of yourself, and wash your hands. That's what I would say.
I like to end it on Tyler's quote of where's the fire? I think that's a great thing to repeat to yourself as you kind of feel a little off. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. It was very informative. Hopefully, everybody that's on the call can take a note of the books that were posted and get at least one tidbit to help bring some levity to their life as we go through the rest of these upcoming months. It was a pleasure having you, and like I said, this will be recorded. It will be on the website. And, we're at time. Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
See you next time. Thank you, sir.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.